This is the second of three lectures on Kundera, although it's the first of two lectures on the Unbearable Lightness of Being. This is the anti-lyrical novel, Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being, Part 1. The first lecture I gave was on Kundera's views about the novel, in which we looked at passages from The Art of the Novel and from Testaments Betrayed and elsewhere in Kundera's writing to get a sense of his views about the novel, of what we're calling here the anti-lyrical novel, which Kundera is opposing to. I mean, he uses the expression anti-lyrical poetry. I'm calling this the anti-lyrical novel, which is opposed to the idea of the lyrical novel, which we said in our last lecture was the conversionary novel, or the novel that is evangelical or thetic, that seeks to promote a particular praxis that is conversionary, which we linked in our last lecture to Soviet socialist realism, and we said is something that Kundera vehemently rejects, and that was at the time that he was, say, a student in Prague, was taught as a matter of routine in Marxist universities, so that if you were a writer, we said, and you were guilty of what came to be called in Zhdanov's, who was the cultural minister for Stalin, Soviet Union, the formalist heresy, if you were guilty of that sin, it was quite serious. And so an entire kind of writing, the writing of Soviet socialist realism, really was hegemonic, and it dominated many decades of cultural production in the Soviet Union. If you happen to be a novelist, or let's say a painter as well, it was something that deeply affected you. Now, so we're going to look at that in relation to this particular novel. Now, the next lecture on the Unbearable Lightness of Being will focus on the theme of animal metamorphosis, and so we'll go in a slightly different direction in that lecture. Here we're following through these questions of aesthetics, which we introduced in the first lecture. Excuse me, but now we talked about them in a more general sense, looking at conjectural statements that Kundera makes, not theoretical statements, not philosophical statements, but conjectural statements that he makes as a working novelist, in his essays on the novel as a form, whereas in this case we want to look at its manifestation of some of these same notions in the actual production of this novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And then this will also take us into a consideration of what I called in the last lecture as well, Kundera's liberalism. So this will involve some discussion, not just of, let's say, the generic, the political implications of the genres of Kundera's novels, but also very overt political criticisms that he offers. Now, I think in the case of the examples here, now Kundera wants to insist that the ideas he throws out are always playful, and we have to be attentive to the tone. We find him in this case, the incident that we're going to look at is something that he also talks about in other writings that are non-novelistic essays. So I think that entitles us to consider them perhaps not as ironic criticisms of the communist world that Kundera lived in, as opposed to some of the more playful and ironic assertions that he makes. Okay, so let's begin. Kundera is going to say again. We talked about this in the last lecture, but I want to emphasize this again, particularly with relation to Unbearable Lightness of Being. He says tone is crucial. From the very first word, my thoughts in the novels I write, Kundera says, have a tone that is playful, ironic, provocative, experimental, or inquiring. The entire sixth part of The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which we're going to look at here a little bit later in this lecture, is an essay on kitsch, whose main thesis is kitsch is the absolute denial of shit. All of that meditation on kitsch is vitally important for me, he says. There is a great deal of reflection, experience, study, even passion behind it, but the tone is never serious. It is provocative. Okay, now kitsch is more popularly defined, more commonly defined as, say, pretentiously bad art. But we're going to find Kundera calling it the absolute denial of shit. And it's going to be a very provocative, playful reading of this very, on the other hand, very serious theme. But I think we're going to see as well that the reading of that Kundera's interest in protecting the realm of the private, he's going to, well, let me say it this way: he's going to describe kitsch. He's going to describe it as a kind of a curtain or a screen that his artist character Sabina is going to rip open. But we're going to see in the case of the public-private, and when he discusses Andre Breton's glass house, which Breton sort of naively affirms, he's going to describe the veil in this case as something that is essential. And in both cases, it's certainly a metaphysical theme. We know, of course, that the veil is linked to the idea of the chora. It's what is suspended over the chora or the abyss, to put it in Platonic terms. Okay, so let's see what he has to say. He says now. Well, let me before we get into that particular reading of kitsch. So one thing I want to say is this. Okay, so we could have spent more time on the last lecture talking about some of the compositional strategies that Kundera adopts. I didn't go into that. If you're interested in novel writing from this perspective of craft, then you should just buy his book and read it and study it very carefully, because I think he has a lot to offer in relation to craft. But one of the sort of this is more a general theme in relation to craft that he picks up on in terms of compositional strategy in the assembling of his novels. This is something that he's picking up on from Flaubert, that Gertrude Stein picked up on, Sherwood Anderson, Hemingway, Joyce, and Dubliners, many other writers were influenced by Flaubert in this regard. And I'm thinking very specifically of Flaubert's Three Tales. Now, if you haven't read Three Tales, that's a canonical text that anybody who's interested in European fiction should certainly read. There we find in Flaubert's Three Tales that it's organized as a kind of a triptych. So you have basically three short stories, each one organized around the theme of saintliness. The question, what is a saint? And it's kind of a triptych in the sense of, like in the Catholic tradition, where you have an altar that you open up, and it's got three different panels on it. And Flaubert organizes his sort of meditation on the question of, what does it mean to be a saint, by bringing together three tales in this fashion. And generically speaking, the first tale is a conventional 19th century literary realism. The second panel in the triptych is a medieval mystery or hagiography, of saintly lives type of story about Saint Julian. And then the third panel in the triptych is kind of the Orientalist writing, which Flaubert loved to write, of Salome, the story of Herod, whose daughter-in-law dances for him, and then he brings her the head of John the Baptist on a platter, to pay for her services. But this is the relation of this book by Flaubert, this very influential book by Flaubert, to Kundera, is that what gives those three apparently different stories and generically different stories unity are two things essentially: theme and motif. The theme of saintliness, and then we see that despite the differences in genre and setting in three different tales, they're nonetheless held together by motif as well. Now, theme, we can think of themes. I'm just giving basic definitions. A theme is a pattern of ideas. A motif is a pattern of images. And so in reading Kundera's novels, they're not novels of 19th century literary realism. That what gives them coherence are themes and motifs. All right, but let's now let Kundera. We'll see how Kundera articulates this himself. This is from the R of the novel. He says, "There is something deeper than narrative that guarantees a novel's coherence. Thematic unity. This was always true, by the way. In the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, this other really important book that Kundera wrote, the coherence of the whole is created solely by the unity of a few themes and motifs, which are developed in variations. Okay, now in this case, for instance, the theme of laughter and the theme of forgetting, and he keeps coming back to these same themes over and over again. And he compares the compositional strategy to something very similar to what, say, Bach is doing in his musical compositions. A theme, but Kundera tells us, a theme is an existential inquiry, which leads me to emphasize. And remember, we said in our last lecture that Kundera's novels are questioning novels. They're not thetically driven. They're not assertions of theses or political. There's no political lesson that's being taught, but he's asking a question about existence, and the question itself is more important than finding any answer. It's a questioning. It's a novel of questioning, and it's a thinking of man as the being who questions in a kind of a Heideggerian sense. Okay, so a theme is an existential inquiry, which leads me to emphasize, he says, a novel is based primarily on certain fundamental words. The novel is built on those few categories the way a house is built on pillars. And then he tells us straight up what the pillars of the unbearable lightness of being are: weight, light, soul, body, the grand march, shit, kitsch, compassion, vertigo, strength, weakness. Okay, now, as I said, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to explore all of these themes, but we'll touch upon a few of them here, such as the grand march, shit, and kitsch. And then in the next lecture, we're going to look at this theme of body and soul in relation to the question of the animal, this Cartesian theme, and follow this up in light of some of the other themes about animal metamorphosis that we've been discussing. However, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about weight and lightness, but those are important themes as well. And there are other important themes too that are beyond what he's listed here, I would argue. Okay, but let's start first with motif. All right, so here he makes a really fascinating point, which I think is really worth pausing and carefully reflecting upon. He says, early in the novel, Tolstoy's novel, Anna Karenina, Anna meets Vronsky in curious circumstances. They are at the railway station when someone is run over by a train. And let me say too, if you're listening to this and you've not read Anna Karenina, well, first of all, shame on you. You need to read Anna Karenina. Also, Anna Karenina is an enormously important touchstone for the study of the novel. But also, of course, in Kundera's the Unbearable Lightness of Being, the Anna is the like Emma Bovary. She's the woman or Hester Prynne. She's the woman who is caught in adultery or has an affair outside of her marriage, and Karenin is her husband. And so Tomas and Teresa, two of the main characters, when they meet, Tomas is reading Anna Karenina, and this is what becomes, and they're also listening to Bach, and this is what becomes sort of, what inspires her interest in him and becomes an important theme of their relationship. So when they have this dog, which we're going to be discussing in the next lecture, at first they named the dog after Anna Karenina, but even though it's a she dog, she ends up looking more like a male, has a kind of a masculine face. So they give the dog the name of Karenin, who is the cuckolded husband in Anna Karenina. Okay, I just wanted to say that as an aside. Okay. Let's back up. Okay, so this is a motif. But Kundera is saying something here more important about motif that even transcends the question of the novel itself. He says, okay, so early in the novel, Anna meets Vronsky, who becomes her lover, in curious circumstances. They are at the railway station when someone is run over by a train. Now, at the end of the novel, Anna throws herself under a train. This symmetrical composition, the same motif appears at the beginning and at the end, may seem quite, quote unquote, novelistic to you. And he says, I'm willing to agree, but only on the condition that you refrain from reading such notions as fictive, fabricated, and untrue to life into the word novelistic. because human lives are composed in precisely such a fashion. They are composed like music. Guided by his sense of beauty, an individual transforms a fortuitous occurrence into a motif. Remember, a recurring, a pattern of images that recur. Like in the case of, say, Joyce's Dubliners, he has many of these kinds of motifs that hold these stories together, which then assumes a permanent place in the composition of the individual's life. It is wrong then to chide the novel for being fascinated by mysterious coincidences, but it is right to chide man for being blind to such coincidences in his daily life, for he thereby deprives his life of a dimension of beauty. Right, that's a really important point, and I think we can all, if we all just sort of stand back and think about what Kundera is saying, we can all certainly see that this is true in our own lives. It may sound like a banal instance of this, but as I said, when Tomas and Teresa meet, they're listening to Bach happens to be playing, and this is this is going to be, we all have, for instance, our songs, songs that we share with other people, and that gives, and these recurring instances, they bring meaning to our life, and there's nothing wrong with this. This is, as Kundera says, brings a dimension of beauty into our existence. But let's pursue how he develops this even further. Now, in the case of Sabina, she has a bowler hat, and the bowler hat, it belonged, the bowler hat in this case, just to give you a little background, it belonged to her grandfather, who was like the mayor of a bourgeois mayor of a small town, and so it's a provincial kind of hat. And when she puts it on her head, it makes it's kind of surreal in the sense that it's like as what in surreal in the way that André Breton describes, sort of the fortuitous juxtaposition of two completely unlike things that cause a kind of a shock or a stasis, what Breton calls the profane illumination. So when Sabina puts the hat on her head, it's like it doesn't belong, and precisely because it doesn't belong, it proves to be arousing for her and for her lover. And so they and later in the novel, when they meet under very different circumstances after the Soviets have invaded Prague, they remember the good times that they had previously when she wore the hat, and it was sexually arousing for them. But on this occasion, it has a totally different meaning for them because of the circumstances that have changed. So, but the point is that it recurs as a pattern. Now, that in a pattern, that's what a motif is. It's an image like the hat that continues to recur. But the two of them together endow the hat with a particular meaning because they've shared that meaning, that meaning together. In other words, this motif is important to both of them. But when Sabina gets a new lover, who he looks at the hat and it makes no sense to him. It's too late in terms of it entering sort of his lexicon or his world of motifs, because he just looks at it with incomprehension. Okay, but let's see how Kundera articulates. He says, the bowler hat was a motif in the musical composition of Sabina's life. It returned again and again, each time with a different meaning, and all the meanings flowed through the bowler hat like water through a riverbed. In her relationship with Tomas, the bowler hat was a recapitulation of time, a hymn to their common past. But when she put on the bowler hat in Franz's presence, Franz felt uncomfortable, as if someone had spoken to him in a language he did not know. Now, when people are still fairly young and the musical compositions of their lives is still in its opening bars, they can go about writing it together, this composition, and exchange motifs. But if they meet when they are older, like Franz and Sabina, their musical compositions are more or less complete, and every motif, every object, every word means something different to them. Now, this may seem to be a melancholy fact, but there's certainly some truth to this. And so, but I think one of the points that Kundera is making here is that when the novelist includes motifs in his or her novelistic compositions, Uh, Again, we may chide the novelist for saying this is too much of a coincidence if we see the motif recurring too frequently, or like in the case of Anna Karenina, you know, being the way in which Tolstoy sort of puts as neat bookends this incident at the train station. But these kinds of coincidences are not foreign to us. They're part of our of the fabric of our lives, or what Kundera is calling the musical composition of our lives. Okay. No, I'd like to now return. I'd like to now turn our attention to again what we talked about last time when we were discussing the Kundera on Soviet socialist realism. Now, in this case, his character Sabina is a painter, and Kundera tells us that all of his characters in his novels, whether male or female or whatever they are in some sense they are possible selves. His characters are all sort of possibilities of who he is or who he might be. They're not who he is. We shouldn't, for instance, Kundera is not, Tomas, nor is he Sabina, but they're possibilities of selves. Now, in the case of Sabina, it's worth noting that she, like Kundera, is an artist. Although she's a visual artist, she's a painter, and she, like Kundera, has this experience of being censored in the academy because she is, being trained in a particular kind of aesthetic sensibility, which is linked to this hegemonic Soviet socialist realism. Okay. Okay. Just 1 minute. Technical glitch here. Excuse me. Okay. Sorry. Technical glitch there. As we were saying, Sabina is a kind of a let's think of her as having bearing certain similarities in some of her aesthetic struggles with that Kundera himself had as a novelist, although he's not obviously a painter. Right. So here's this. So he tells us, this is in Unbearable Lightness of Being. He says Sabina pulled out an old canvas, which she had done during her school days, a period when the strictest realism had been required of all students. And art that was not realistic was said to sap the foundations of socialism. In the spirit of the wager of the times, she had tried to be stricter than her teachers and had painted in a style concealing the brush strokes and closely resembling color photography. Now, we said, you may recall, we said that in terms of Soviet socialist realist aesthetics, that there was a mandate to be representational. And so she's, what Kundera is describing here is that she pushes it as far as possible. And now her paintings look like, literally like, photographs. That would be a realist representation of aesthetics. Although, say, for instance, someone like Sergei Lukács would consider this to be, naturalism, and therefore not attentive to this idea of the typicality, which was also this more Hegelian notion that Lukács affirmed. But in any case, she's an art student. She's trying to do what her teacher's saying, and she's representational in a very sort of hardcore way. But then she says, here's a painting. She says, here's a painting I happen to drip red paint on. So she's got one of these really realistic paintings. She happens to drop red paint on it. She says, at first I was terribly upset, but then I started enjoying it. The trickle looked like a crack. I began playing with the crack, filling it out, wondering what might be visible behind it. Of course, I couldn't show these paintings to anyone. I'd been kicked out of the academy for not being, realistic, for being guilty of what we called in our last lecture, what we called the formalist heresy, playing around with form as opposed to following the representational mandate. And so she says, on the surface, there was always an impeccably realistic world, but underneath, behind the backdrop's cracked canvas, lurked something different, something mysterious or abstract. On the surface, an unintelligible lie. Underneath, the unintelligible truth. Okay. So that's that. There we find Sabina again. That's a fascinating description of a young artist forming her own aesthetic sensibility, and she comes to this impasse in her development as a writer when she realizes that this hegemonic, dogmatic, doctrinal state aesthetics essentially is a kind of a veil or a screen to cover up a kind of a lie. And when the veil is ripped open, it's not really possible for Sabina to go back to believing in a naive way in that kind of realist aesthetic. Okay, so here's what Kundera says, and I think we can say in many ways this is very, again, we don't want to conflate Sabina with Kundera, but we can certainly see parallels. He says Sabina's initial inner revolt against communism was aesthetic rather than ethical in character. What repelled her was not nearly so much the ugliness of the communist world as the mask of beauty it tried to wear. In other words, communist kitsch. Okay, we said kitsch is pretentiously bad art, but Kundera is going to define it as the denial of shit. So in other words, it was communist kitsch, the communist denial of shit that instigated her revolt. The fact that there is, as we say, shit happens, that there is shit in life, and the communist regime tried to cover up this aspect of life under communism. Kitsch is a folding screen set up to curtain off death. It's fascinating observation. In the realm of totalitarian kitsch, all answers are given in advance and preclude any questions. It follows then that the true opponent of totalitarian kitsch is the person who asks questions. A question is like a knife that slices through the stage backdrop and gives us a look at what lies hidden behind it. My enemy is kitsch, not communism, Sabrina replied. Okay, very fascinating. And now Kundera makes this very explicit when he has, for instance, Sabina go to the United States and interact with the politician who does something like, runs in a field with daisies with children, and the sun is shining and everything seems wonderful. Kundera criticizes that as well. So it's not a celebration of, let's say, capitalism, liberal democratic capitalism in the West. That's not what is at stake, because he sees what he's calling this kitsch that is the enemy of Sabina, as present in both the so-called First World, United States, France, you name it, but also in the communist world. This is a much deeper problem than any particular political ideology, and Kundera suggests it's a metaphysical kind of question. And the veil, of course, is the question of the veil is a question of metaphysics, and it's, again, as we said, linked to what Plato's going to call the choral abyss. But I don't want to read too much into that, because this is, we're just trying to read Kundera and what he's saying, and not reduce this to ideas. But I do want to underscore here again this question of the true opponent of totalitarian kitsch is the person who asks questions. And we know that that's exactly what Kundera has told us, that this is what he does as a novelist. He asks questions. This is also this Heideggerian theme of, the question of the question. And this makes him an enemy of totalitarian kitsch, because this is exactly what he's advocating that novelists do. Okay, here's more on kitsch. Toilets in modern water closets rise up from the floor like white water lilies, Kundera writes. The architect does all he can to make the body forget how paltry it is, and to make man ignore what happens to his intestinal wastes, after the water from the tank flushes them down the drain. We are happily ignorant of the invisible Venice of shit underlying our bathrooms, bedrooms, dance halls, and parliaments. This is, again, this denial of shit, what we don't want, that which we don't want to think about. So he's going to say, now he tells this little story. He says, when I was small and would leaf through the Old Testament, retold for children and illustrated by Gustave Doré, I saw the Lord God standing on a cloud. He was an old man with eyes, nose, and a long beard. And I would say to myself that if he, God, had a mouth, well, he had to eat. And if he ate, he had intestines. But that thought always gave me a fright, because even though I come from a family that was not particularly religious, I felt the idea of a divine intestine to be sacrilegious. Okay, and there's Gustave Doré's biblical deity, God, standing on a cloud. This is probably the very image he's talking about. That as a child was so disturbing to him. Does God have intestines? An interesting question. Kundera says, spontaneously, without any theological training, I, as a child, grasped the incompatibility of God and shit, and thus came to question the basic thesis of Christian anthropology. Now, remember again, this is very playful. He tells us this. We shouldn't read this as philosophy. These are playful ideas he's throwing out. Tone is very important, and this is very provocative. And note too that that Kundera is emphasizing that this goes back to this idea of light and weight, the gravity of the theme of God, and then this other theme which seems to be frivolous, the theme of shit. And so thus I came to question the basic thesis of Christian anthropology, namely that man was created in God's image. Either or. Either man was created in God's image and God has intestines, or God lacks intestines and man is not like him. The ancient Gnostics felt as I did at the age of 5. In the 2nd century, the great Gnostic master Valentinus resolved the damnable dilemma by claiming that Jesus ate and drank but did not defecate. So this leads Kundera to conclude that shit is a more onerous theological problem than is evil. Since God gave man freedom, we can, if need be, accept the idea that he is not responsible for man's crimes. The responsibility for shit, however, rests entirely with him, the creator of man. All right, now again, these are provocative themes, but on the other hand, and they're frivolous, but on the other hand, they have a certain gravity as well. He says the objection to shit is a metaphysical one. The daily defecation session is daily proof of the unacceptability of creation. Either or. Either shit is acceptable, in which case don't lock yourself in the bathroom, or we are created in an unacceptable manner. It follows then that the aesthetic ideal of the categorical agreement with being is a world in which shit is denied and everyone acts as though it did not exist. This aesthetic ideal is called kitsch. Okay, now note again, this is a profoundly metaphysical theme which transcends either communist or capitalist, democracy, socialism, so on. It goes way beyond the question of the political order of the day, and it's a problem. It's a question that one wrestles with. Okay, back to our critique of Soviet socialist realism. Soviet films, which flooded the cinemas of all communist countries in that cruelest of times, he tells us, were saturated with incredible innocence and chastity. The greatest conflict that could occur between two Russians was a lover's misunderstanding. He thought she no longer loved him. She thought he no longer loved her. But in the final scene, they would fall into each other's arms, tears of happiness trickling down their cheeks. Right? These are, again, these kind of kitschy, films. But note, he says here, none among us is Superman enough to escape kitsch completely. No matter how we scorn it, kitsch is an integral part of the human condition, which is why he investigates it. Okay, now I'll give you another example. For instance, he's going to say very provocatively in The Art of the Novel that Flaubert's greatest discovery was stupidity, the problem or the question, the existential theme of stupidity, which is a theme like kitsch that Kundera is investigating. And it sounds comical to say it, but Kundera is going to say, well, stupidity is a great existential theme. More contemporary literary theorists like Avital Ronell have investigated it. She wrote a whole book on stupidity, which she discusses Flaubert on Stupidity. I recommend it. It's a fantastic book that also explores this theme, but in more that Flaubert explores in Bouvard and Pécuchet, and in his Dictionary of Idées Reçues or Received Ideas. She also investigates, and so it's an important theme. This is the kind of theme, the theme of kitsch, the denial of shit, and stupidity. These are the kinds of discoveries that novelists make in their investigations of being, and and as frivolous as they may sound, they're important themes indeed. Okay. I want to shift now to a slightly different theme, but it is related in the sense that it still implies a question of Kundera's critique of life under socialism, but extending to the post-Soviet world as well. And it's also again linked to the idea of the curtain, the screen, as we saw in Sabina's dripping of paint on the canvas. And so, but just to give you a little background on this, Václav Havel, who lived from 1936 to 2011, was a writer like Kundera. I believe he was a playwright who wrote a book called Living in Truth that was published in 1986, prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when he after he wrote this book, which influenced, say, Fukuyama in his End of History and the Last Man, Francis Fukuyama. He became, interestingly enough, the first president of the post-Soviet Czech Republic, and he was president from 1993 to 2003. So he was a literary man turned politician. As described in the Washington Post in 2011, his simple on his obituary, his simple but extraordinary idea was that the most effective way to defeat a totalitarian regime was to live in truth. Okay, now Kundera, as a fellow Czech and a fellow writer, artist, didn't agree with this at all, and so he doesn't mention Havel by name in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, but his critique of this theme of living in truth, which he saw as essential, as ridiculous and naive, is clearly evident in The Unbearable Lightness of Being. So let's see what Kundera does with this. Now he starts by, and then you find this in other places too, like in Testaments Betrayed. He critiques Andre Breton's notion of the glass house. Okay, now think about in, like, let's say when famous photo session of John and Yoko Ono standing there naked. The idea, we don't, let's just, we have nothing to hide, or Allen Ginsberg showing up in parties just wearing, tennis shoes and being otherwise completely naked. This idea, we're just gonna, I'm gonna pull back the curtain. I'm gonna show you everything I got, and I got nothing to hide. Kundera is essentially rejecting this idea, and we find this idea also in Andre Breton's glass house metaphor, like we should all live in a glass house. Here's Kundera. He says, an old revolutionary utopia, whether you're talking about fascists or communists, life without secrets. This is what Havel say, living in truth, where public life and private life are one and the same. The surrealist dream that Andre Breton loved, the glass house, a world without curtains, where man lives in full view of the world. Ah, the beauty of transparency. But the only successful realization of this dream, a society totally monitored by the police. Okay, now as someone who lived in a totalitarian regime, Kundera is not in any hurry to live in a world where there are no secrets. He's going to find this split, this division between public and private, which is, again, at the heart of liberal ideology, say, in opposition to, like, this idea that you find in more radical Marxist positions that, that the public, or that the private is already public. Think of women burning their brassieres to show that even the intimate garments that one wears are not, private, but political. that there is nothing that isn't political. This view Kundera is going to find very, very disturbing. He's going to insist on the contrary, that we need the curtain. Again, this metaphysical idea of the curtain. We need to have a sphere where we can live a private life that is hidden from public view. Now, it's hard to say. Kundera does very few interviews these days, but with what's going on, for instance, with Facebook, Instagram, the way that we're so public on the internet, and where we seem to have no private lives left, I'm guessing that for Kundera this is a kind of a nightmare come true. But he's going to insist upon the importance of one being able to have a private life, to the suspension of the curtain, in order for the very idea of the individual to continue to exist. Okay, so let's see what he says. He says, I wrote about this. This is from Testaments Betrayed, but it's also in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, this story that he tells, which is why, again, I said, I think we can think about this particular theme as being perhaps about a matter that is approached with less irony than some of the other themes, since he talks about it in contexts that are outside the framework of the novel, in which these kinds of themes are essentially supposedly are supposed to be more playfully ventured. As I wrote about this in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, Jan Prochaska, an important figure of the Prague Spring, came under heavy surveillance after the Russian invasion of 1968. At the time, he saw a good deal of another oppositional figure, Professor Vaclav Cerny, with whom he liked to drink and talk. Now, all their conversations were secretly recorded, and I suspect the two friends knew it and just didn't give a damn. But one day in 1970 or 1971, with the intent to discredit Prochaska, the police began to broadcast these conversations as a radio serial. For the police, it was an audacious, unprecedented act. And surprisingly, it nearly succeeded. Instantly, Prochaska was discredited, because in private, a person says all sorts of things, slurs friends, uses coarse language, acts silly, tells dirty jokes, repeats himself, makes a companion laugh by shocking him with outrageous talk, floats heretical ideas he'd never admit in public, and so on. Of course, we all act like Prochaska. In private, we badmouth our friends and use coarse language. That we act different in private than in public is everyone's most conspicuous experience. It is the very ground of the life of the individual. Curiously, this obvious fact remains unconscious, unacknowledged, forever obscured by lyrical dreams of the transparent glass house. Right now, remember again, that lyrical is a kind of a dirty word for Kundera, the lyrical dreams of the transparent glass house. And so it is rarely understood, he's going to say, to be the value one must defend beyond all others. Now here, I don't think this is in the Testaments Betrayed. I don't think this is irony in Kundera's part. Here we find, in my view, a thesis, and I think it's an important thesis worth thinking about, particularly those of us who live in liberal democratic states where we have, for instance, the United States First Amendment, which encodes this idea of the public and the private split. But here we find somebody who lived within a totalitarian political world in which the private was violated, but in very disturbing ways. But let me also say, if you read like Kundera's Immortality, he sees this exact same process at work in say liberal democratic France as he saw in Prague when it was under communism. So again, this is not he's not necessarily critiquing communism here or socialism. It's more of a human question, a human problem that he sees in both political contexts. Thus, only gradually did people realize, Kundera says, though their rage was all the greater, that the real scandal was not Prochaska's daring talk, but the rape of his life. They realized, as if by electric shock, that private and public are two essentially different worlds, and that respect for that difference is the indispensable condition for a man to live free, that the curtain separating these two worlds is not to be tampered with, and that curtain rippers are criminals. when it becomes the custom and the rule to divulge another person's private life. We are entering a time when the highest stake is the survival or the disappearance of the individual. So I think this is not ironic, and this is a theme that he explores in the Unbearable Lightness of Being. But again, it's this very, I think, very solid defense of the idea of the curtain that separates the public and the private, and the notion that those who tamper with that curtain, who tear it down, are essentially criminals. And that's a very strong statement, but I think it gives us a lot of food for thought. So, okay, living in truth, this theme that Havel advances, that Kundera firmly repudiates. What does it mean to live in truth? Putting it negatively is not enough. Putting it negatively is easy enough. It means not lying, not hiding, and not dissimulating. But for Sabina, living in truth, lying neither to ourselves nor to others, was possible only away from the public. The moment someone keeps an eye on what we do, we involuntarily make allowances for that eye, and nothing we can do is truthful as she sees it. Keeping a public in mind means, for Sabina, living in lies. Sabina despised literature in which people give away all kinds of intimate secrets about themselves and their friends. I think this is, we find Kundera saying very similar things, again, not in his novels, but in his essays that are not, encoded in this sort of fictional novel framework. And so I think Kundera certainly agrees with this. I think at one point he says, for instance, that anyone who writes a novel to settle scores is surely on the road to perdition. And so a novel should not be a place where one discloses secrets. One should, if one has friends, one should protect their friends by protecting their secrets. He says, for a man who loses privacy loses everything, Sabina thought, and a man who gives it up of his own free will is a monster. Okay, very, very provocative. Now, Franz, who was Sabina's lover, on the other hand, was certain that the division of life into private and public spheres is the source of all lies. And Franz becomes a kind of a figure of Havel, the naive, nice guy, but naive, who believes that one should live in truth. And Franz is the one that says, well, I want to live in truth. And this causes him a rupture in his relationship with Sabina because she can't, it's a bridge too far for her. A person is one thing in private and something quite different in public. But for Franz, living in truth meant breaking down the barriers between the private and public. He was fond of quoting Andre Breton on the desirability of living in a glass house, which Kundera tells us is a very dangerous, naive idea that that those lyrical souls out there who sometimes become revolutionaries love. Okay, now here's another instance of this. When Teresa and Tomas hear about this radio broadcast of Prochaska's private life being exposed, and it makes her think of her mother, because her mother used to read her private diaries. And so she thinks about, to her friends, and then laugh, make fun of her in front of her mother would make fun of her daughter in front of her friends, just by, finding these really private things in her diary and reading them out loud. So this makes her think of her mother when this incident happens and the radio shows are aired of Prochaska's private conversations. Does that perverse need one has to expose one's ruin, one's ugliness, to parade one's misery, as her mother does, like walks around naked when she's old and not very attractive with the windows open, to uncover the stump of one's amputated arm and force the whole world to look at it. That was why, after she heard about the radio broadcast, she told Tomas about how her mother had read her secret diary at the dinner table to an accompaniment of guffaws or laughter. When a private talk over a bottle of wine is broadcast on the radio, what can it mean but that the world is turning into a concentration camp? A concentration camp is a world in which people live crammed together constantly, day and night. A concentration camp is the complete obliteration of privacy. Okay, now, also in the Book of Laughter and Forgiving, Kundera, thinks about this in relation to the erotic. Because you think of the erotic itself depends upon what is veiled or what is hidden. Roland Barthes, this was a theme in Roland Barthes, as well as there can't be desire unless there's something that is veiled and hidden in the sense of erotic desire. But at a concentration camp, we've all seen these images of naked bodies, being, standing in lines, just horrible images of human suffering, but also quite, grotesque. These are bodies without clothes, but there's nothing erotic about them whatsoever. There's no desire either. The very last sentence of the Book of Laughter and Forgetting is, these European people are standing on a nude beach on the island of Daphnis and Chloe in Greece, which is in fact the island of Lesbos, Greek island, and they're all walking around naked, but they have absolutely no they have no desire for one another, and so desire in that sense depends upon what is veiled and what is hidden. This is also an important theme or dimension, of the question of the veil. Okay, all right. Teresa knew. Almost from childhood, Teresa knew that a concentration camp was nothing exceptional or startling, but something very basic, a given into which we are born and from which we can escape only with the greatest of efforts. So this is terrible, but it's what Kundera is fighting against, the idea of the world being turned into a giant concentration camp, which he sees if we have no privacy, that's what is essentially at stake, and then it'll be impossible for us. Not only will we be living in a world of hell, but we won't be individuals either. We have no possibility of individuating or developing ourselves as individuals. Only a few weeks earlier, before her episode with the engineer, this is when, in the novel, when she has this regrettable affair with the engineer, although she does learn some things about herself in spite of it. She had scoffed at Prochaska for failing to see that he lived in a concentration camp where privacy ceased to exist. But then when people threatened to expose her affair to Tomas, she says, well, what about her? By getting out from under her mother's roof, finally escaping her mother's house, she thought in all innocence that she had once and for all become master of her privacy. But no, her mother's roof stretched out over the whole world and would never let her be. Teresa would never escape her mother. Now, this is terrible. It's what, Teresa's mother is a very abusive person, but it's a terrible kind of realization that after going through this kind of abuse and the loss of one's privacy as a child growing up, living in a house where there was no privacy and thinking she'd recovered it, that she suddenly realizes as an adult that privacy itself is something that is disappearing from the world. All right, here's Kundera from The Art of the Novel. Totalitarian society, especially in its more extreme versions, tends to abolish the boundary between the public and the private. Power, as it grows ever more opaque, requires the lives of citizens to be entirely transparent. The ideal of life without secrets corresponds to the ideal of the exemplary family. A citizen does not have the right to hide anything at all from the party or the state, just as a child has no right to keep a secret from his mother or father. And then here he gives the example from Franz Kafka's The Trial, when it begins with the violation of his privacy in his own bedroom. And against those who say that Kafka's writing about alienation and being alone and suffering being alone, Kundera's going to see things quite differently. He says, not the curse of solitude, but the violation of solitude is Kafka's obsession. Joseph K.'s story in The Trial also begins with the rape of privacy. Two unknown men come to arrest him in bed. From that day on, he never feels alone. The court follows him, watches, talks to him. His private life disappears bit by bit. swallowed up by the mysterious organization on his heels. Now, lyrical souls, again, remember, this is not a valorized term for Kundera. Lyrical souls who like to preach the abolition of secrets and the transparency of private life do not realize the nature of the process they are unleashing. The starting point of totalitarianism resembles the beginning of Kafka's The Trial. You'll be taken unawares in your bed. They'll come for you just as your mother and father used to do. Okay, so as we're concluding here, just want to recall something that Kundera says. We'll think more about in our next and final lecture on the unbearable lightness of being. He says, the characters in my novels are my own unrealized possibilities. That is why I'm equally fond of them all and equally horrified by them all. Each one has crossed a border that I myself have circumvented. It is that crossed border, and think of the borderline again. We're thinking also this question of the veil, of the border beyond which my own eye ends, which attracts me most. For beyond that border begins the secret a novel asks about. The novel is not the author's confession. It is an investigation of human life and the trap the world has become. Okay, so I think I think that gives us some sense of Kundera's. We've in the last two lectures we've looked at Kundera's, his approach to the novel, his thoughts on the novel and what a novel is and what he's trying to do. And we've said also how it's not a philosophical novel in the sense that he's doing philosophy. We've said that in Kundera's writing that the novel itself subsumes philosophy, but we've also said that as a novelist, he's a novelist who reads, who's clearly read philosophy fairly deeply. Heidegger, Descartes, Herschel; these are touchstones in his work, and we see how his writing contains also a very strong critique of totalitarianism, but also in an aesthetic sense, the very form of his novel is itself a kind of a rebuke to the doctrines of Soviet socialist realism, as we've discussed. Now, in the next novel, we're going to set aside some of these questions and look more deeply at questions linked again to Descartes and these themes about the animal that we're pursuing and what Kundera does with the animal. And I think that he has, like Derrida and Derrida's The Animal, Therefore I Am, he has a lot to teach us about the animal and about thinking about the animal. But he does it, and unlike Derrida, who's a critical theorist, he's doing it through his own art as a novelist. And so we'll follow that up in the next lecture.